Hi, I'm Mike Sussman, a writer and producer on Voyager and Enterprise, and you're watching Sci-Finatics, and I am today talking with Nick about my idea for a new Star Trek series called Star Trek United.
Well, hey everyone, welcome back to Sci-Finatics. I'm Nick, and today we've got something really special for all you Star Trek Enterprise fans out there. I'm joined by Michael Sussman, one of the key producers and writers behind Star Trek Enterprise. Michael's written some of the best episodes of the franchise, including Twilight, Future Tense, and In the Mirror Darkly two-parter. Now he's back with a bold new vision for the next chapter of that story, a series proposal called Star Trek United, which imagines Scott Bakula's Jonathan Archer as president of the United Federation of Planets. Michael, it's such a pleasure to have you here. Welcome to the show.
Thank you, Nick. I appreciate it. It's fun to be here.
First off, congratulations on all the buzz surrounding Star Trek United. Can you tell us how this concept first came to be? What was the core spark? Was it something that's been on your mind for years, or did it kind of grow out of recent Trek developments?
Yeah, it was something that first popped into my head about 2.5 years ago. It was very accidental. I was reaching out to my former Star Trek colleague, Scott Bakula, about potentially working on a new project, a project that was not science fiction, had nothing to do with Star Trek. So I was reaching out to Scott. I hadn't seen him in many, many years. So I thought I'd start off with a little levity and make a joke about Star Trek Picard, I think had just premiered not long before and was a big success. And I said, oh, when are we going to see Star Trek Archer on television? And before I hit send on that email, it just suddenly caught, what Star Trek Archer, like what would that be as a television show? And I flashed back to the last episode that I wrote for Enterprise, which was In a Mirror Darkly, and we saw a view screen graphic from the future that I had to write in case it was visible on screen, and it ended up actually being visible on screen. And it established that after becoming an admiral and leaving Starfleet, Archer got into politics and eventually became president of the Federation. And at the time, I imagined I had to put like years in it, as you would in a biography. So I put it something like 25, 30 years after Enterprise. Here we are all these years later. It suddenly occurred to me, if Scott was going to play Archer today, he'd be president. Oh my gosh, that is a television show. What would that be? So I rewrote my email to Scott and said, oh, I have this thing I want to talk to you about. By the way, I also have an idea for how Archer could come back in a new series, if you want to hear that as well. So it was a very accidental, fortuitous, serendipitous beginning.
What has it been like seeing fans rally around your United proposal online?
I've gotten a lot of emails and certainly posts. It's been really great. I think a lot of people, they miss that character. They miss many of the characters from that show. Something Enterprise has in common with the original series is that there's a feeling among the fans that they were robbed, that they were hoping 7 seasons, and the show was really firing on all cylinders in season 4. And then we were canceled along with our network, basically, and all the corporate shenanigans that were going on at the time that were way above the pay grade of us writers and actors ultimately caused the show to go away. So yeah, it's been very gratifying to have all these fans come out of nowhere, seemingly, and be so supportive of this idea. And I think they're really excited at the potential of revisiting Scott's character, for one, seeing where he ended up. At some point, I'm sure the show would check in on the rest of the cast as they're available. And also getting into certain storylines that we were unable to do on Enterprise, such as the Romulan War, which, if you think about it, really would have occurred between episode 21 and episode 22 of season 4. We kind of just skipped right over it. And so this show would be set many years. I know. So this show would actually be set many years after. That was a conflict I wanted to know more about, certainly.
Absolutely.
And so one of my ideas for this show is that it would actually open with a flashback to a scene set during the Romulan War, where we would see the crew, some of the crew anyway, of an XL1, and they'd be in this very well, I don't want to say too much about what they're doing, but we'd see some of the war in that opening scene. But it would also be a pivotal scene establishing a brand new character who would be pivotal to the series moving forward. So there'd be a little bit of fan service in there, I guess, in terms of seeing.
That sounds good to me.
But sounds larger.
Sounds great. Bit of AI, bit of deep fake de-aging, with some of the cast members.
That's right. I think that would be a great reward for the fans who I think were waiting to see some part of that storyline that we never got to do. We did a fair amount of stuff, certainly in season 4 with the Romulans. and that was great fun, and we were building up toward it. But this would, in many ways, be more of a spin-off of Enterprise than a sequel. I would love very much to see as much of that original cast as I could get from time to time. But it would really be centered on Archer in this new role and his 4 adult children that we would be meeting as well in the pilot. And they are spread out across the galaxy in various functions. One kid, it's weird to call them kids, they're probably around 30. One kid would be working in diplomacy, another's in Federation intelligence, another is in Starfleet. My idea is that the kid in Starfleet does not use Archer as a surname because of how they want the preferential treatment. So he uses his mother's surname, which is Hernandez. That may mean something to fans of Enterprise. It's a little bit of a deep cut. So I don't know if you remember in season 4, there was the captain of the NX-02 was an old
That's
flame.
right. That's right. Okay, so they would end up married with kids, right?
Well, not necessarily married, and kids singular, kid plural.
Maybe divorced with kids then.
Not decided, but at least one is using the Hernandez surname, which I thought was interesting. That's something I haven't really chatted about before.
I've been racking my brain thinking, who would be the mother of some of Archer's kids? I was trying to think. There was no really long-term love interest character for Archer. He kind of had a few little mini relationships in singular episodes, but I couldn't think of one definitive character that would be his wife or mother of his kids. So that now that you say it, makes complete sense.
Well, it was sort of natural because I needed some of the kids to be of a certain age. So it's kind of backed up into who was Archer with.
And from what you said before, there was maybe an implication that maybe not all of the kids would be from the same mother.
I think I've said all I want to say about that for now.
Okay.
But one of the kids is using mom's surname.
Gotcha.
When I was developing the idea, when I first mentioned it to Scott, obviously we wanted to run it up the flagpole at the studio. But before I could do that, I needed to sell Scott on it. So I needed to be sure that he was happy with where Archer was. So there was a lot of talking and a lot of thought put into how he is a different character in many ways, or not a different character, but a character who has evolved over time and where he is in his life. And I think it would be a very fresh change to have a former Starfleet captain who becomes a family man. Scott is a family man. And it seemed like the closer I could make Archer in his time after the show more like Scott, the more Scott would be attracted to the concept. But also, we did 98 episodes of that show. I didn't want to do the same show again, and neither did Scott. Seeing how Archer has evolved over the years, that was really appealing, I think, to both of us.
You described the series as kind of like a West Wing in space, or inspired by the recent Star Wars Andor series. What does that mean in the context of Star Trek? How would you balance political drama with that sort of sense of wonder and hope that Trek is known for?
I would definitely want to keep hope alive, to borrow a phrase. Yeah, I think the show would not be limited to walk and talks in this futuristic West Wing in the White House.
Yes.
I would honestly be cribbing quite a bit from Deep Space Nine, which was certainly a series that was set at a home base where you found all the characters. But it would also be something that could, again, through the lives and the careers of the kids who are off on important missions involving diplomacy or a Starfleet mission, a rescue mission, whatever it may be. And also getting into the idea that even though the Romulan War is in the rearview mirror, the Romulans are not. I think it would be a show with a lot of background issues, a lot of background conspiracies, cloak and dagger. There would be a Jean Le Carré element of what's going on. That's one of the reasons I wanted one of Archer's kids in the intelligence service.
When you say intelligence service, would this be Section 31 or another division of Starfleet?
It would not be Section 31.
Right.
I wrote a Section 31 episode of Enterprise, although we never actually even named it Section 31. That was just sort of the assumption at the time. This would be the more Federation intelligence agency, not Starfleet intelligence, and not that there would be a I'm sure, a back and forth and a competitive nature between those two agencies. But also, we've seen a lot of Section 31, and quite frankly, I would want to see what's going on with Federation intelligence. It's wide open in terms of story potential and establishing it, and that goes back to why this series idea is appealing to me. I mean, I'm certainly aware
100%.
of fans, much like myself, who may be tired of prequels, and I get that. But as a storyteller, you want to go where the story is. What story hasn't been told?
That era between Enterprise and the first season of Discovery is largely unexplored in Star Trek stories, I think. So how would you envision that world in terms of political and also sort of the visual tone of that early Federation period?
There's so much there to figure out, quite frankly. As you mentioned, I think there's literally 101 years between season 4 of Enterprise, which was 2155, and 2256, which was the first season of Discovery. And aside from the fact that the Federation was founded in that era, we really know next to nothing about it. As you did in a wonderful little video, you looked at some designs that I'd been noodling with the great Andrew Robert, who had heard about the show on social media and had reached out to me about potentially designing some ships. So he's been noodling what a presidential craft would look like in this era, something that could take Archer and his staff to friendly worlds and perhaps to not so friendly worlds. So that's been great fun. But everything Andrew has done, he worked on Next Gen, obviously, designed the Enterprise D, the Romulan Warbird. Before that, he worked on the refit Enterprise for the motion picture. But all of his designs were thinking like what came after Matt Jefferies. I think it's been an interesting challenge, not only for him, but for me, but to rewind that a bit and wonder what came before. And so we're playing in that area there. When Andrew reached out to me querying whether there were any elements of the show, spaceships or something that he might think about, the first thing that came to mind was the president's ship. One idea was he would simply fly around on whatever the workhorse Starfleet ship is, but that's not a good analogy for what happens in the real world. So let's give him his version of Air Force One, and what would that be like? So there were a lot of questions about the technology of the era. Would it have a saucer section? And so we talked quite a bit over a few weeks via texting and email. Ultimately, it's about finding like a fun shape for a ship. And he showed me an old design of his that was sort of this wedge-like vessel that had 24th century engines on it. I thought it was really cool, and I thought, well, if you make those look a little more appropriate to the period, look more like of on the NX-01 or
NX-01,
could totally work. So we've been proceeding along those lines. But one of the things that was I thought particularly interesting, Kirk's Enterprise couldn't land; it was too big, too unwieldy, but we felt that this ship would sort of need to land on a diplomatic mission. However, it's got presumably big honking warp nacelles. So how does that work out? Well, that's where we came up with the idea of this starship separation, basically, where this very aerodynamic space plane, basically would lift off, and you'd leave that star drive section in orbit. Now, I think the design that was publicized just showed like a tiny little shuttle in the front, but
like almost like a shuttlecraft size on the nose of the ship. Yeah.
But Andrew has continued to send new ideas and drawings to me. And I think the direction we're going is a much larger craft that would be very sleek and aerodynamic, and that would enter the atmosphere and take Archer and his team on these diplomatic missions. We're trying to think, how is the technology in this era different from 100 years in the future or 80 years in the future, where you don't necessarily, in this era, you don't have shuttles that can travel at warp speed. My inspirations, rather, was the Vulcan shuttle from Star Trek: The Motion Picture, which of course
Andrew designed.
And I love that design. And it's a ship with these giant nacelles and a little shuttle that perches on top, and that's how that craft gets around. And I just love the mechanical storytelling logic of that. So again, it's about figuring out how is the technology in this era different, more primitive from what we saw in TOS, but also perhaps slightly more advanced from what we saw in Enterprise. And that's the fun of this.
Yeah, I guess it's about balancing that kind of proto-Federation look of Enterprise with how far do you lean into the early aesthetics of original series or even Strange New Worlds.
Yeah, exactly. It is about finding that balance, and there is no rhyme or reason or logic to it. It's about what feels right, what looks good. So we're figuring it out. Again, we're all just playing around. He's doing this for fun, and I'm doing it for fun. It's a I never thought in a million years I'd be collaborating with Andrew Probert on a Starship.
Yeah, wow.
Yes. So we'll see where all that goes, but hopefully at some point, if this project were to ever move forward, he and I could talk in a little more detail about these various ships and locations that would need to be designed. I have a lot of ideas about how that era would have unfolded. Certainly when we left off on the final season of Enterprise, if you sort of take out finale for a moment, we did this really wonderful two-parter called Demons in Terra Prime that was really about this racism, anti-alien sentiment on Earth that was sort of threatening to tear everything apart. To go from that to an Earth that was still caught up in this sort of xenophobic fever to the Federation, like in the very next episode, that was like a huge leap.
So, that was a big jump. Yeah,
that was a big jump. And it's interesting because Troy has a line in literally the last scene of the episode where she says,
"You wish you could tell them all that this alliance will give birth to the Federation."
And it really got me thinking that perhaps the Federation wasn't quite fully baked at that time, and that there was still a lot more to do. Just as
a work in progress.
A work in progress, exactly. Just as the United States started, we had the Articles of Confederation for 10 years that were not quite working out. We had a constitutional convention, a Bill of Rights, and an actual constitution come out of that. So I'm imagining something kind of similar happening to the Federation in those years, and making Archer an integral part of it. When he comes into office, things aren't going all that great, but he's the man to fix it. He's the hero everyone has been waiting for, and I think he might turn out to be quite different from what certain people in power were expecting before he comes into office. It's just
some parallels there, perhaps. Yeah,
a few real world parallels, but it's such a rich area, and again, it's a way to tell stories that have resonance in today's world, that are not partisan in the way that so many issues are. And when you take a contemporary issue and remove it and allow people to experience it through the prism of science fiction, where you have characters with antenna and green skin and all sorts of very different appearances, when you watch a show where those people can find a way to make it work, it's actually encouraging to us in our world to realize if those alien people can figure it out, then maybe we can do the same thing here on Earth today.
Very true. Absolutely. Just talking before, I mentioned Star Wars Andor, which I think you might have mentioned was a bit of an inspiration or whatever. Despite kind of generally being pretty well received, that obviously series had a focus on politics and government, and but could occasionally get bogged down in aspects which sort of slow the overall story process down on occasion. How do you think you'd kind of balance out stories of Federation politics, diplomacy, leadership, with more exciting kind of action-orientated stories?
I see this show as a political thriller, and certainly there's going to be elements of action in it, and that's one of the reasons to have, I think, Archer's adult kids out there in the field, and they would help provide for that. But the show is a political thriller, and in, say, the vein of Hunt for Red October, Syriana, 13 Days. One way of experiencing, say, a starship battle, being in the thick of it. We've seen that a bunch of times on Star Trek. That's great fun. That's very exciting. But to watch a battle, say, in the Situation Room, in the the command center of whatever the White House is, where you're not getting all the information, where you're just seeing bits of data on a screen as some important event is unfolding, that's exciting and tense in its own way too. I compare it to the episode "The Wounded" from Next Gen, where they're trying to catch this Federation ship that's attacking the Cardassians, and they watch the whole battle on the view screen, and it's just dots on a grid. And it's one of the most intense, quote unquote, battles ever in Star Trek. And you don't see anything. I think there are certainly times when you you would take the show into that battle, but there's also something about being a step removed from it that is interesting and exciting in its own way. So that's I guess sort of how I'm approaching it.
Let's talk about Jonathan Archer himself. Where do you see him emotionally and philosophically at this stage of his life as president rather than captain of a starship? And how might his leadership style have evolved, do you think?
Well, I think he's definitely evolved. I think when we met him in season 1 of Enterprise, he had a very Earth-centric, human-centric view. He honestly seemed a little bit entitled in some ways. Felt the Vulcans should have been sharing more of their technology. Visiting an alien planet and insisting that your dog be allowed to come down with you. It was very funny and charming, but he did have just a sense of entitlement about him. I think he's grown in the years since then. I think he's definitely matured. I think even in season 4 of the show, we saw how he did a mind meld with this character who carried the katra of Surak. I think we even saw Archer perform a Vulcan nerve pinch at that time. So I think he has a new appreciation and respect for Vulcan society, and certainly a lot of that has to do with T'Pol. I think he is a much more measured leader. I think during the Xindi conflict, he did some things that perhaps in hindsight, he thinks he could have handled differently, so he may have some regrets, but he also doesn't obsess over them. I think that experience, his experience during the Romulan War, which we'd learn a little more about, have changed him. I think he's definitely a different person. At the center, still the same man who wants to forward this project that he started, the Federation. That was something we wanted to do at the beginning of the series. This was going to be a run up to the Federation and show how Archer changed over those 7-10 years, however long we mapped it out. And so we would now see him on the other side of that 20 or 30 years later, when this project that he helped put together is sort of on the verge of falling apart. How can he save it? Well, those are the details of the show and the series that make, I think, for some great storytelling.
Has Scott had any input in terms of where he would see Archer?
Oh yeah, for sure. We spent quite a bit of time talking about it, and me writing up some ideas of where he would be. Once I pitched the idea to him, he was cautiously interested, but he wanted to know where Archer was, and specifically how he was different and how he had evolved, because he played that character for 4 seasons. These are the seasons in the early aughts that were 22 or 26 episodes. So we saw a lot of that character, but to pick him up all these years later and show how he has changed. I think unlike some of the other Star Trek captains, I think Archer had sort of the most room to grow or improve. The man in this era, I think, is wiser and tempered and not so easy to say fly off the handle as we saw him do. It was great fun to show him.
Yeah, because he was
passionate
in the
leader.
early years in Enterprise, he was very much haunted by the weight of command. I felt.
Yeah.
And having to traverse those kind of tough moral grey areas that we kind of saw him wrestle within the Xindi arc. As this, things like this has kind of made him the man that he's become. Or
that's exactly right. That's exactly the thinking. The experiences that he had during this conflict with the Xindi and the Romulan War changed him irrevocably. Something that I think is kind of interesting is that I think in many ways, Scott is less like Archer than, say, William Shatner is like Kirk, or Kate Mulgrew is like Janeway. And I've seen them all talk at conventions about how they've sort of, over many years of playing those characters, the characters sort of became them and vice versa. And I don't think really that was the case for Scott and Archer. I think he progressed. I think Archer progressed and became a little more of the reasoned and understanding and tolerant person that Scott is. But Archer was very much a hothead. That's great fun to write, and it was great drama. But I just, he's been measured. He's been measured by the years and tempered in his judgment. He's definitely changed. And that makes it interesting for me as a writer. And it makes it interesting for Scott to play him. But I think also what's kind of fun is that I think the people in that universe might see him a certain way. They might see him as this Eisenhower, this war hero, this sort of kick-ass guy. And he is that. But at the same time, I think he's going to get in there and subvert their expectations. Be the president that the Federation needs, maybe not the one that it wants.
Tell us a bit more about the setting for the series.
This is a project that was pitched to the powers that be about 2 years ago. They were working on another project that they felt was similar and was set in the same location.
Would this be Starfleet Academy?
Well, the series, yes, like it would be Starfleet Academy, which was under
Yeah.
development at the time when I pitched it. And the assumption was, my assumption when I was developing it at first with Scott, was that, the Federation, we've seen the Federation president on Earth and, the movies and the shows. So clearly that's where the show would be set. When they suggested that this story was perhaps too close to what they were already doing, I took a step back. Then I did a little digging deeper, and I realized, like, why did this show have to be set on Earth? We don't know about this entire 100-year time period. There's a lot we don't know about. And so it certainly seemed plausible that we could establish Federation headquarters, whatever they would call it, whether it's actually the capital. I mean, some organizations, the EU, for instance, has headquarters and does not have an official capital city. And you would think in this era where these races who are still trying to get along probably wouldn't want any of their planets to be called the capital. So it is this headquarters space where they all meet. And we knew certainly from Journey to Babel would be a pivotal episode here where Sarek mentions that they are on their way. The Enterprise is on its way to the council chambers on Babel. So it just seemed very natural. Oh, well, we've never seen that planet. That planet has actually been in the title of 2 episodes, but we've never actually arrived at it. We journey to Babel, but we never get there. Well, in this show,
we never get there. Yes,
we'll get there, and we'll see what it's like. And I have a lot of ideas that I hope are interesting about how it's not just your typical Class M planet. Captain Kirk described it as a planetoid, so I thought it might be this very interesting, terraformed, geo-engineered environment that's sort of like part space station, part asteroid base, but also when you're standing outside, it looks like you're on the surface of a planet. So there's a lot to figure out there. And certainly I've been chatting with Mr. Probert about some of my ideas for this. But again, these are things I think to figure out. But what that did for me was immediately it made it a show that was set in deep space, that felt much more Star Trek, felt much more Deep Space Nine. It felt like this center, this galactic community, basically. And so that was very interesting to me. And I thought, if the show gets on the air and runs a couple of years, your final season could be about why it is no longer the capital or the headquarters in the future years, and sort of like tie that bow. And I have some interesting ideas along those lines that I'm also not going to share. But I'm really looking at the original series as the touchstone. And obviously there are Discovery and Strange New Worlds are set in the years immediately prior. And at this time, this is an era where the races in this organization don't quite trust each other entirely yet.
Like kind of a UN version of DS9, I guess.
The UN is certainly a parallel. So perhaps the EU and NATO. It's sort of a combination of those three. Putting the Federation on the path to becoming that pluralistic democracy that we saw in the original series and certainly in Next Generation. I like the idea that it is not there yet, and it will be. Archer's mission is to get it there, and how important that will be to not only the people of the Earth, but all the races of this Federation. It's a show about getting along, quite frankly.
How would you see those kind of early tensions playing out between the founding worlds of Vulcan, Andoria, Teleprime, and Earth, and how the Federation kind of finds its footing? That would be fascinating.
It is. It's a show that would cut back and forth between perhaps Archer is in the council chambers on Babel. Next scene, you're with his son aboard a Starfleet vessel out on the frontier. You're with his daughter on some covert ops mission for Federation intelligence. A third is with refugees. His kids might be spread out on various worlds and ships. And even if they don't realize it at the time, all of their storylines will touch in the end. The Romulans will very much come into play in a big way in that season 1 storyline. So I would see each episode as a chapter in that story, that there would be a beginning, middle, and an end. But there is sort of an overall season 1 arc story that I would want to tell. There's just so many opportunities to tell sort of very Star Trek-like stories, the kind of stories we've definitely seen on Next Gen and TOS. You're just telling them from sort of a different angle. And again, that finding that fresh approach to the types of stories that we've seen and loved on these shows. For me, that's what's exciting about the premise. Now,
Speaking of Romulans, could you bring back Todd Stashwick as Talok?
Talok, he played,
yeah.
or at least that was his major Talok was his Vulcan name. He was a character we had created, sort of this commando character who we established that T'Pol had served with years before, and that he thought perhaps she had become a traitor because she was working with Archer. So his character was quite the thorn in her side. And then we find out at the very end of the episode, he's undercover. He's been undercover for years. He's a Romulan agent, and he has been subverting the true interests, one would say, of most Vulcans. And we had plans to bring that character back. At least I did, and unfortunately, we didn't get to see him again. So I love the idea that he is still undercover all these years later, probably, certainly as a Vulcan, up to no good, and trying to subvert the that relationship between humanity and Vulcan. I have a lot of ideas of what that character is up to in the present. I'd love to get Todd if he's free and available. Maybe he'd be jumping back and forth between the set for Legacy and we'd be shooting across.
Yes.
You never know. Anything could happen.
You never know. Tell us about some of the storylines of Enterprise that were kind of slated to happen had the series, been renewed for more seasons. And would any of these stories be worth resolving in United? So, like, obviously we've talked about how many Enterprise fans were disappointed they never got to see the Earth-Romulan War, the NX-01 refit, or primarily have the Future Guy mystery resolved.
Well, it's interesting you say that, because I think this show, because it would be a different show, I think that there would be a lot less science fiction in this premise. I love spatial anomalies. I love temporal anomalies. I love a good anomaly.
Yeah. Yes.
But you have to figure, and this is where the parallels with Andor come in. Andor was a show about people who were not Jedi Knights, who had possibly never even met a Jedi, who never seen a lightsaber. There have to be, billions upon billions of people who live in the Federation who have never gone through the Guardian of Forever or experienced anything, as wacky as the crews of these starships did from week to week. And that's exciting, and I want to see that stuff. But this is about people who don't deal with that and have perhaps more down-to-earth concerns. And so I'm totally open to revisiting storylines from Enterprise that make sense for this show. Again, the show is really a spin-off and not a sequel. As for the identity of Future Guy, I think my former colleague Brandon Braga has had some ideas about that. I would possibly avoid it because, as I was saying earlier, this is a show that is not really going to deal with a lot of the familiar sci-fi tropes, such as time travel.
Brandon has spoken about that publicly, and he had, I think, correct me if I'm wrong, but he did actually say that Future Guy would have actually turned out to be an older version of Archer. Is that? I think that's what he said.
I think I've heard him say that. Yeah. I don't recall. There may have been discussions in the. I'm sure there were discussions in the room about who Future Guy was. I don't see revisiting the temporal Cold War in the show, quite frankly. I'm not saying a show like this would never revisit some of those ideas or dive into the sci-fi realm, but I think certainly in a first season, which we don't even have that, we don't have a pilot. This is a television show. I would want the show to really stand on its own 2 feet before diving into that lore from the old shows, but also the more science fiction-y concepts. Establish this show for what it is, a grounded show about grown-ups dealing with the repercussions of these starships that go out there and explore the strange new worlds. And these are the stories of the people who have to make it all work and make the diplomacy work. But I don't know. I think it's such an exciting premise, and it's a way to tell the type of stories that I as a fan love, but to tell them from a different perspective. And sometimes that's enough to like crack open an idea or a premise for me and see it from a whole new way. And because it is that character's perspective, that different perspective, that can really bring a story to life for an audience.
Since Enterprise, the antagonist races of Suliban and the Xindi have never really, to any extent, been seen again, apart from, I think, a very brief Xindi reptilian appearance in Star Trek Prodigy.
Yeah.
Is there any kind of thoughts in your head in terms of what happened to them? Because they were pretty main races, but we haven't really ever kind of readdressed them to any great extent. Any thoughts there?
I think one of the most powerful ideas that Star Trek in all its various forms promotes is the idea of a former enemy becoming a friend. Watching the pilot episode of Next Generation, where you see Worf in the background on the bridge, who's not even really a primary character at that time. But the fact that he's there and you realize this was the adversary of the previous show and the films, and they're friendly now. Now, obviously, they went in a lot of different directions with the Klingons, and that wouldn't last.
Yeah.
But, we saw them as people. So I would love the idea of exploring the Xindi, perhaps, from that perspective. I don't know if they've established in any of the later shows if they ultimately joined the Federation, but I like the idea of that certainly happening, if not in this show, and at some point in the future. But I think for me, that's part of the whole Roddenberryan message or optimism that I would want this show to embody.
That sounds fascinating. What former Enterprise cast members would you feel might be appropriate to return in United, whether that be as, just a guest appearance or as a series regular? Could Shran be Archer's chief of staff, perhaps, or Hoshi as communications director, or Malcolm as head of the Secret Service detail? Any thoughts on that?
See, those are all great ideas, but now I feel like I can't do any of them because you said them. Now they're so obvious. Look, I would love to have everybody from Enterprise appear at some point on this show in some capacity. What that would be, I don't know. I don't know that the role of the communications director for the presidential mansion on Babel will be a character that would have as much screen time as CJ had on the West Wing. So whether that would appeal to someone like Linda Park, I don't know. I would have to write the episode. I have to write the pilot to find that out. That's one way, I guess, of saying maybe. I do love the relationship, certainly, that Archer had with Shran, and I would love to continue that in some way. There are a lot of issues with, actors and availability, so you never quite know what you're gonna be able to do. And obviously, you'd want to reach out to these cast members before writing a big arc for them, because if they're not interested or unavailable or working on something else, then you got a little bit of a problem. So again, I would love to see everybody in some capacity, and if they're a recurring character, if I find a role that makes sense for somebody, yeah, absolutely. And there are one or two characters who I won't mention who from Enterprise who I could see in regular roles. There are a lot of hoops to jump through to get to that point.
Speaking of past characters or whatever, a lot of fans maybe believe the killing of Trip Tucker maybe was a little bit of a misstep at the end of the series. Would you ever consider bringing this character back from the dead? And if so, any ideas on how you might do it?
I mean, I'll say this. I have ideas for how Connor would appear on the show. That's really all I can say about that.
Alien in makeup? A different character? Or are we maybe Trip in?
I mean, I could just tell you the whole, I could just act out the pilot and my action figures out.
Go for it. Yes.
But as I said, I would want to see everybody in some capacity, and I definitely have ideas about how we might see him. And I'm not entirely convinced that what we saw on the holodeck in the series finale happened exactly the way it did in real life. But I'm aware of all the various novels and theories about what happened. I've got my own ideas. So we'll see.
We'll see. Given today's world, a story about unity and cooperation definitely feels especially timely. Do you see United as a commentary on our current global climate, or more of a hopeful antidote to it?
I think in many ways it would be both. It would be in the tradition of all the best Star Trek. It would be about smart, dedicated people from diverse backgrounds pulling together and tackling impossible problems. But instead of Archer being at the helm of a starship, he is running the ship of state, and it is a different perspective perspective on those types of stories we've seen before. And again, I think what's so wonderful about science fiction in general is it allows you to tell stories about what's going on, but you're in a safe space, and people do not get hot-headed and feel that they're being attacked, because there are so many layers of allegory and metaphor. The best science fiction and the best Star Trek isn't about telling people what to think, but is asking them to think and showing all the various sides and showing characters who they might have thought they weren't interested in examining, and seeing how the other side might think and might live, and to walk a mile in their shoes. That's what I would want this show to do.
What is your core philosophy on canon for this series? Would you strictly adhere to every established detail, or would you allow some flexibility if it served the superior story?
Well, canon is interesting. Certainly, every one of the shows has been a little fuzzy at times on certain aspects of canon. For me, it's all about the original series. It is setting up that show. And the big point, certainly for the season 1 storyline that I've talked about involving the Romulans, one of my favorite episodes of the entire franchise is Balance of Terror, which established Romulans as a race. And there were a lot of details that were set up in that episode. One of them being that no human, Romulan, or ally has ever seen the other. Now, we sort of already violated that because Archer got into a fist fight with Todd Stashwick, but he didn't know he was a Romulan.
He didn't know. That's okay. We get away with it.
Right. The original series and those films, and Next Gen to a degree as well, are sort of the touchstones that I would be trying to not step on. I wouldn't want to, for instance, meet a race that clearly had a first contact scenario with Captain Kirk or Captain Picard. I don't think I'd be running into too many Ferengi on this show, in other words.
Yes.
Whenever there's a disagreement in terms of canon, in my mind, it would be, well, what did the original series say about this issue? What did Next Gen? Those are the Roddenberryan shows, and I would want to be as consistent with them as possible.
If United had an opening mission statement or mantra delivered in voiceover to open the show, what would be its central message?
Wow. I don't think the show would have a Space, the Final Frontier opening. Although it always bothered me that Enterprise didn't get that, because I really felt, I think if you're going to do a show about a ship called the Enterprise, you get to have that opening. You get to do Space, the Final Frontier. In fact, that was my one contribution to the series finale of Enterprise, where we flew off into the sunset.
We've got to put it in there.
And we got to see Kirk and Archer and Picard sort of split up that saying, and it was really a wonderful way to end. But yeah, I don't think this show would have that kind of a statement. But that said, it also wouldn't have probably a rock song as its theme.
It was a little bit divisive, wasn't it?
But I would. It's funny because I think, was it the episode "Take Me Out to the Holosuite" where they played the Federation anthem, which I thought was kind of interesting. That opening sequence would include music along those lines that would be uplifting and hopefully inspiring.
Do you remember who composed that?
I might, it might have been Dennis McCarthy.
Was it Dennis McCarthy or Jay Chataway, or I'm trying to remember.
Okay, I think it was McCarthy, but don't quote me on that.
Yeah.
I'm not saying that would be the theme song for the series, but the best Star Trek themes. I mean, certainly the Voyager theme that Jerry Goldsmith composed, as well as the Next Gen theme. To me, those would be thematic touchstones for what I'd want to. The show is ultimately an optimistic show and a hopeful show that embraces that Roddenberryan future, so the music should embrace it as well.
And you probably have to get an Archer's theme in there somewhere, I suppose, wouldn't you? From Enterprise, I wouldn't mind hearing that. Ran over the closing credits.
Yeah, well, that's what we did on Enterprise. We don't want to repeat ourselves too much, but I would like to hear a brief reprisal. Sure.
A motif, throw a little motif in there. Yes. Are there any closing thoughts or messages you'd like to leave the fans today about United?
Well, I would say if this sounds like an intriguing idea to you, then post about it, tweet about it, hashtag it. I think there are, there's a lot going on at Paramount right now in terms of the studio, and they may buy a whole other studio. They've got a lot on their plate right now. Also, I think the fans are blessed with a lot of television, a lot of Star Trek that's in production right now. There's something like 4 seasons of Trek in the pipeline, as I understand it. It would be a little while before anything would even potentially be done with this premise, if indeed anything is done. But for me, it's about you want the people in the ivory towers on Melrose Avenue to be aware of it at the very least, and be interested in perhaps hearing a little more about it. That's all I would suggest. I mean, obviously there's been big writing campaigns in the past that have been successful for some shows, and sometimes they're
And
not
unsuccessful for others.
So
Yeah.
you never quite know. It's about timing and luck as much as anything. But look,
Yeah.
people are interested in this by and large because of Scott, and I think people want to see him again in this role. I know I do. The hope is that he's available if they do decide to move forward with this, because I think
Yes.
not if he's busy, and he's a very busy man. He may move on to other things. So I'm not saying there's a clock on this, but there might be a clock on this. I would encourage people, if they're excited by the idea, to post about it and to get their friends to do the same. I would love nothing more than for it to happen, but it is right now just kind of a delightful fantasy that we're chatting about. Television sort of starts that way. What if? And so I'll leave it at that.
Well, Michael, it's been absolutely fascinating hearing about your vision for Star Trek United and how it continues the legacy of Enterprise in such a meaningful way. I know a lot of fans, myself included, would love to see the story come to life, and it's inspiring to hear how much thought and heart you've put into it. Thank you so much for taking the time to chat with us today, and everything you've contributed to the Star Trek over the years. Your work has had a lasting impact on the franchise and the fans who love it.
Well, thank you, Nick. It's been my pleasure.
And to everyone watching, let us know in the comments what you think of Star Trek United. Would you like to see Jonathan Archer return as President of the Federation? We'd love to hear your thoughts. I'm Nick, this is Sci-Finatics. Live long and prosper, and we'll catch you on the next one.